Hello and welcome back. I am Ricardo, aka the Mad Hatter, and this is a series about color theory and how we can exploit it to creatively use light and color. Our journey is much like building a house. We're now setting the foundation on top of which we're going to build our home. The goal is to create a comfort zone where we can effortlessly use light and color to free our creativity. As such, I would highly encourage you to check the previous videos in the series, as those are essential steps to the journey. Before we move on, if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to leave feedback in the comments. What do you do and don't like about the series? What would you like to see me explore in more details? Last time, we wrapped on the concept of middle grey and how it allows us to intentionally under or overexpose a scene to set a creative intent. Today, we're going to complement that with the concepts of contrast and contrast ratios. Contrast is commonly defined as the difference in lightness between the darkest and brightest part of an image. In cinematography, we tend to be more technical and describe it as the difference in stops between the blackest black and the whitest white and all the gradation of grey in between in a frame. That also ties contrast to the concept of middle grey, as we often describe contrast in a scene by X stops under and Y stops over middle grey. In a future video, we're going to learn how to use these concepts to scientifically translate a high dynamic range image coming from a camera, which often has 13 or more stops of dynamic range, to an image that can be reproduced correctly by an SDR monitor, which is capable of reproducing about 6 to 8 stops. Today though, we're going to look at the more creative aspects of contrast. In particular, we're going to focus on two topics. One is the difference between high and low contrast, and the other is the difference between different contrast ratios. So for example, high key, low key, or silhouettes. Thanks to the magic of editing, we are already in DaVinci and I had an outfit change. As you can see, I prepared a timeline with a lot of grey patches. Reason being, we need to first look at a bit of a technical aspect to then go into creative one. This patch that we see here, that we start off, is simply a grey patch. So a perfect middle grey, zero exposure. There's an important concept that we need to first understand now. Thus far, we refer to middle exposure as middle grey. And we sort of looked at the two things as one entity. In cinematography, effectively, when we refer to middle exposure, we're actually looking at the range that goes from -2 to +2 stops. That's a very important distinction for all the technical terms that we're going to discuss now. Let's first start with high and low contrast. With high and low contrast, we usually refer to scenes where the difference between darkness and light is either stark or moderate. Let's look at the first example here, and first uncheck the Lachman zones. There we go. So this is what we usually refer to as a high contrast situation. If we activate the Lachman zones, you can see that we're ranging from -4 to +3 stops. So we have a 7 stops difference, which is pretty stark, pretty consistent. And visually, we can see a lot of difference between darkness and light areas. If we go to something like that instead, this is generally referred to as a low con or low contrast. If we enable Lachman zones here, we can see that the range goes from -1 to +1. Let's now look at a few different patches now, where we have two boxes, and let's imagine now that the smaller patch is the subject of a scene and the larger patch is the background. Looking at all the different cases that we can have, so underexposed, grey, or overexposed, combining these, we can fall into different situations and ratios between our subject and the background. In this case, for example, we are looking at a subject that is at +1 exposure on a background that is at about -1. So the range here is about 2 stops, as you can see here. And effectively, this is a normal contrast level. The same thing could be in this case where we have a 0 exposure subject on a -1 background, or vice versa, a 0 exposure subject on a +1 background. In all these different cases, the contrast ratio is moderate, and thus the subject doesn't really stand out because of the contrast. And rather we should use color, for example, in this case, to create some depth in the image. Still, A contrast like this allows us to have a lot of details everywhere basically, and not really have areas where it's either too bright or too low, so we really start losing details. Let's now look at all the different cases where the background is underexposed. And again, in this case, by underexposed, we mean a background that is below -2 stops compared to middle gray. In this case, for example, you can see that the background is at about -4 stops, while a subject is at -3. The subject in this case doesn't really matter, as another example where we have a subject that is middle gray and the background is at about -3, or even this case where we have a background that is at -3 and a subject at +2. All these different cases, still, they are defined by a dark background, on top of which the subject tends to stand out, more or less, of course, depending on the situation. In all these different cases, we refer to the scene as a low-key, or we say that the scene has a low-key look. Low-key looks in general tend to create a moodier image and are often used in horror movies or action or thrillers. On the other end of the spectrum, let's look at scenes where the background is overexposed. In this case, our subject might be middle gray or might be overexposed, and still we would be talking about high-key looks. A high-key look tends to make everything look very cheerful, very colorful, and thus is often used in comedies, for example. When a subject becomes underexposed now, regardless of the background, in this case we talk about silhouettes. In general though, silhouettes are very powerful images. Are images where the subject will stick out a lot, they can be epic at times, and so using them in a conscious way can really elevate the look of your project. With all this wrapped up, with all this concept wrapped up, let's now start looking at a few practical examples. Let's start with an example of a low-con look. In this case, we can see right away that the image doesn't have a stark contrast to start with. The blacks are quite lifted, and similarly, the white points are really pulled down. Even if this is a very bright source, in the scopes you can see it's sitting at just about 80%. If we activate the Lachman zones, we can see this even better. You can see that in terms of underexposure, we're going to about -2 stops. The majority is just -1 stop. And above 0, we're going just +2. So our range of contrast is about 3 stops. So this is a very compressed contrast, and what it creates is a soft image. It's very gentle roll-offs, for example, and blooms. And this works really well in situations where you have a lot of atmosphere. An opposite example would be a high contrast look, like this one. In this case, we're looking at a bleach bypass look, which inherently has a lot of contrast. And you can see how the images stretch in the scope, but if we activate the Lachman zones, well, in this case, you can see the shadows are dipping into the range of -4, and the highlights are at about +4. There are bits that are at +6, but this is more noise than anything else. But you can see in general, even just on the face, we are ranging from -4 to +2. So even just on the face of the subject, we have a range of 6 stops for a total of about 8 stops. This means we are really stretching the image to even the limits of our monitor. Keeping it contained, of course, is what creates a beautiful image that still looks natural, but just has, it's rough, right? A high contrast like this makes for a really rough, hyper-realistic image. If we look at the shot here, this is a perfect example of a mid-level of contrast that neither categorizes as a high-key, low-key, silhouette, high contrast, low contrast. If we activate the Lachman zones here, we can see that we range from about -2 to +2, at times +3, but again, this is more noise than anything. And as a result, in this image, we can really see everything. That's the main purpose of a mid-level of contrast, giving you an image that is really easy to read. Looking at this shot now, this is a perfect example of a high key look. You can see that everything is still contained. So if we zoom in, there's still detail in the sand, for example, in the dress, even in the flower, okay? The clouds will still have texture here, so everything is protected. But if we activate the Lachman zones, you can clearly see that everything here is really sitting from +2 up in terms of the exposure. The only thing that is correctly exposed is the shadow area of a face, and this is really important because especially with high key looks, giving a point of correct exposure allow the eye to calibrate, and also if we deactivate the Lachman zones, allow us to get a face that still looks pretty natural, pretty readable, and has all the information, all the texture. Let's now go to the other end of the spectrum. So this shot right here, this is a low key look. If we activate the Lachman zones, you can see that our subject is correctly exposed. The contrast ratio on the subject is not too stark, at least on the face. So we range from -1, -2, where it dips too much, to about +2. But the background itself, it's really dark. It's almost all -4. An important thing to look for in a low key look is, again, similar to the high key look, to still get details in everything that is going past the +/- threshold. Finally, let's look at this shot here. Here we have a silhouette. So what was the definition of silhouette? A scene where a subject is below -2 exposure. If we activate the Lachman zones, you can see, well, in this case, actually, it's a borderline silhouette, I would call it, since a subject for a lot of the subject is actually at -2, but still a good portion of it is below -2, and also the background is pretty bright in this case, so still the contrast ratio effectively gives us an effect where we do have some detail, which is important when you're making a silhouette. If you want to make a very interesting silhouette, not to kill the detail in the silhouette, but just keep just a touch. But the very bright background really sets the figure apart. And this scene, well, this is really interesting seeing the character hand here is shaking, he's suffering from PTSD, and the silhouette really allows us to see the shaking. So that's the power of a silhouette that I was referring to before. Well, mates, today we finally wrapped the first part of this series. I hope that by now you're more comfortable with the concepts of light justification, exposure, and contrast. From the next video, we're going to add another layer of complexity, introducing color. As we did for the first part, we're going to take it step by step. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.